Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 517 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum Podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, June the 5th, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, very good question. It's funny how Irish people panic when get asked that in the US or Canada. They're like, "Wait, what? Where are you from? Where are you from first?
Why do you want to know?
The accent."
What's it
But
to
yeah,
you?
it's funny. We always panic. We're like, "Wait, what a minute!" But I am David Nihill. I'm the founder of Funny Bizz, which is a conference series and community aimed at upping engagement rates using humor. And I'm the author of a book called "Do You Talk Funny," which is all around using humor in public speaking.
So you reached out to me. We have a lot of connections in strange ways that we didn't sort of connect. I'm friends with Tim Washer. I know you've had Tim Washer speak at your event.
Yep.
And there's other connections with people like Tucker Max and Ryan Holiday and stuff like that. So it's super interesting. But this is a topic that has been near and dear to my heart for a long time. So I'm finally able to talk with someone else about this topic. And damn it, I'm excited.
Yeah, well, that makes two of us. I get pretty excited about this stuff.
So here's the first place that I want to start with you, because when I start talking about the dynamics of stand-up comedy, and listen, I live in Montreal. We have the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival. The founder of it, Andy Nellman, a close friend of mine. I'm not a guy who's sort of a comedy club rat and I sit in the clubs or I go to shows. I really don't. I don't even spend a lot of time watching it. I appreciate comedy, but I appreciate the sort of mechanics of what they're doing as somebody who speaks, and not just for public speaking, but rather as a better way to communicate a message to an audience. And when I tell people about that, their first reaction is always, yeah, but I'm not funny. I'm like, no, you're not listening to me. I'm not talking about being a stand-up comedian. I'm talking about using the tools they use to elicit a laugh to powerfully convey a message. And people still can't get past that. They're always like, but I'm not funny.
Well, yeah, and to be honest, if you ask a group of people in the States or Canada, are they funny? They'll probably say no. Whereas if you ask people in Ireland, they'll be like, oh, yeah, no, we're pretty funny. So it differs a bit, but I think a lot of people base that on style when they're looking at a comedian. They're like, all right, well, I could copy Chris Rock's style. He's obviously amazing, but that's probably going to get me thrown out of my next conference, and I'm not naturally funny. But if I say, well, you can replicate his techniques and adapt them to your style, because his style is personality. You're not going to be able to copy that. But what are these guys doing? What are they learning the hard way as they clock up those 10,000 hours to make them a master of what they're doing? And how can we take some of that and build it into our world of communication? And we 100% can do that. But you're very right. When you breach it to people initially, they're just like, well, I'm not funny. But I'm like, well, I can guarantee, and I did. I mean, I remember so many nights when I was in comedy clubs when I met people who I classed as not funny. I thought they were there to watch the comedy show, and it turns out they were the comedy show. And before they went on stage, I was thinking, this is the least entertaining, least exciting person I've ever met. Surely you're not going to go on stage to be a comedian. This is going to end really badly. And when they get on stage, they absolutely crushed it for 10 or 15 minutes and have people belly laughing, and then quickly went back to being fairly unfunny off stage. And the one thing these guys all were showing in abundance was they were getting funnier over time as they were learning the techniques and the mechanics of being funny, especially on stage. Now, some naturally were, and they did really well faster than the other guys, but there was a whole bunch who I would have said were not naturally very funny, but every one of them had the ability to be funny.
And I was thrown into the arena, a rather big arena, public speaking. I've told the story many times, but my first public speaking event was like on a bill with Dr. Phil in front of 7,000 people. Like, it was insanity. And I did a lot of prep work leading up to it. I didn't sort of pull the whole, last minute slam together some slides and then be very apologetic on stage because I'm not a public speaker, but here's some content and try and survive the moment. Like, yeah. I really went into it, and it obviously led me, and now we're in 10 plus years since that happened, where I do a lot of events a year. I've got representation and I enjoy it. And I think when you enjoy the craft of public speaking, and I I hesitate on public speaking because I think it's just presentation skills where I want to focus, because all of us have to present, whether it's in a round table to say who you are and where you're from, or in your team, or an idea to your team or to your boss. I mean, we're all in those public speaking, those presentation arenas. I I I really liked it, and because I liked it, I feel like with most things that we all like, you dive deep into the mechanics of it and what more can I learn and who are the coaches and where are the books and where are the YouTube videos and on and on. And it actually led me, I would say at the bottom of it, meaning when I got down into the years and years of studying this, that there were two areas that I felt were the best place to study to get better at this. One was stand-up comedy, and the other one was magicians and magic. So we're focusing on this area of stand-up comedians, and I'm wondering for you, what was your journey like to get to that point where you're like, there's a massive correlation here, and I can help people unpack what that means?
Yeah, I think, I'd listened to a lot of comedians being asked, very high level, very successful comedians being asked what they were doing and breaking it down. And for me, they were never really breaking it down and explaining it in a way that was pure technique. Like, here I'm using the rule of three. Here I'm flipping the expectation at the end. Here I'm very consciously calling back to something I made earlier. Here I'm wrapping it as a story so the performance feels complete. All these little things that I just felt they weren't really explaining. So when my journey went into it, I was like, well, all right, I'll be the guinea pig for this stuff. Like, I'm going to do it for over a year, crashing as many clubs and festivals as I could, pretending to be a fairly accomplished comedian and making it look that way just to be able to get booked and share the stage with these guys. And just very consciously sit there and note what exactly is happening here, and can I recreate this in any way myself? So little things like the rule of three and having two elements and then flipping expectation on the third element. So you're essentially, your comedic sequence becomes something like 1, 2, 4, and I wasn't expecting 4, I was expecting 3, and that little flip of expectation is why I laugh, and just very consciously leading people.
Stop right there, Dave. Hold. Explain. That's like a lot of. So you just went right into like how the hot dogs are made without explaining anything. Break down the rule of three, two elements, and the flipping break it down so that people understand what you're talking about here.
Yeah, sure. So rule of three, I should apologize first. Irish people can't even pronounce that number, as you probably figured out with that one. You're like, wait, did he say tree? I'm not sure.
Yeah. I got you. We're good. I'm Canadian. I get
it. True. Rule of three essentially is three. We have become our minds efficient at recognizing patterns by necessity, and three is the smallest number of elements we can recognize as a pattern. And any break in that pattern generally results in your mind either laughing or relieving some sort of recognition that there has been. And in comedy, it's generally a laugh when you flip that expectation. So rather than giving people a sequence of 1, 2, 3, we give them a sequence of 1, 2, 4. And 4 becoming the flip of expectations generally results in a laugh in stand-up comedy. So the first two items you use are very much regular and normal and trying to establish a pattern. And very much like a boxer throwing a left, like a jab, and then a big right, as you're always taught to in the world of combat sports if you're doing it when you're doing boxing. It's that left, and then the brain just doesn't see the right coming because it's looking for a pattern, and it sees left, and then another left.
Give an example of it.
Yeah, so if I said I went on a date with a girl last night and she was amazing and fantastic and rather hairy, all of a sudden you're not talking comedic gold, but the third item is so different than the first two items that it creates a moment of laughter in somewhere where you weren't expecting it. So, for example, on the back of my book, I have 3 testimonials, and you would expect those 3 testimonials to be famous people traditionally. And I have 1, 2, and then the third one is from my mother saying she's never even read the book, but she thinks it's nice. Essentially. So even with any form of content, that flip of expectation on the third item makes things funny.
Okay. So now link that back to, because I stopped you, you're on a good tangent there about stand-up, about your connecting these pieces between what you're seeing and then, wait a second, there's something here that actually hasn't or isn't being communicated as much as it should be to the general public.
Yeah, and we very much did that because I think most people, when you look at breaking down comedy, they quickly distance themselves and say, well, that's cool. I am never going to do that. I'm very much in a business environment. And what we did it by, or what I did it by, was looking at TED Talks and all the leading TED Talks and finding a correlation with humor, because nobody had actually put some research to it. I had a hunch that, and a curiosity, that humor was very much a key part of successful TED Talks, and it had been identified by many, but nobody had put a metric to it. So we actually went back and we applied a metric called laughs per minute that comedians use to rate their own performance on how many laughs they generate per minute. And sure enough, when we looked at all the most successful TED Talks, every single one of them moved the humor needle, and some of them at a rate that actually generated more laughs per minute than the funniest movies of all time. And these were being delivered by researchers, you know, like Sean Asher or Ken Robinson or Mary Roach. They're 3 or 4 of the top 11 most viewed TED Talks ever, and they all have more laughs or equivalent laughs to movies like The Hangover, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. So there was a very clear correlation there in business world that these guys were actually using the same techniques. A lot of the time they just didn't know about it. And they were becoming masters of their craft, very much like yourself, by clocking up a lot of hours on stage. And in many of their cases, they hadn't broke down actually what they were doing. Am I using a structure here that's used by a comedian? And if so, how could I improve that quickly? So my journey was very much using those items, but making sure there was a way of correlating those items back to the business world from comedy, or vice versa with comedy to TED Talks, and showing people, all right, does something happen here? The humor, the entertainment level is expected by your modern day audience. If you go on after one of these funny guys, you're going to know all about it. So let's try and explain the techniques to you so you can reproduce it for yourself.
I often tell people that one of my favorite movies of all time is Jerry Seinfeld's Comedian. And I loved it so much because I think where I was at in my career in terms of the amount of speaking I was doing, I felt a sort of kinship to that thing where you're out on the road and you're by yourself, and the working of the material, and that even when you're at the top of it, it's still that sort of drudgery because, well, there is a real nakedness to getting up there, and there is nothing, right? They clip a mic on you and go at it. And for me, that documentary at the time that it came out and where I was at in my life, I felt that, wow, like it's true. Like if I want to be good at presenting at a basic level, if I want to scale that to be a very good public speaker, stand-up comedians really are the best at that. And the stakes are super high because, you know, and again, if you watch Jerry Seinfeld, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, he's right. Like a lot of his stuff is like, you know, you're hoping this audience that knows nothing about comedy finds you funny. And it's this very strange relationship, but it's the same thing a little bit in the business world where you have a message to send and the audience has no idea where it's coming from or why you're delivering it. And you really have to convince them to see your side. And I think getting a laugh to this day is still one of the hardest things to do.
Yeah, and I would agree with nearly all of that. The only thing I'd say, Jerry Seinfeld's a fascinating example because he's the ultimate writer in the US and probably the world for taking an everyday thing that isn't really a story, it's a witty observation, and really honing it to really, really great writing and working on it so hard that it eventually becomes really, really funny, and testing every correlation of that. And I think that's enough to scare the average business speaker off trying to do humor, because it does.
I was going to get to that part. Don't spoil.
Yeah, no, but it does. Like if you watch an interview with him and he's like, I spent 4.5 years crafting this one bit to be perfect.
Yeah, the famous
yeah,
Pop-Tart
100%. Like you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to be doing that. Or you'll see Jerry Seinfeld in the movie you reference trying to write some new material, and it's failing. Like they're not laughing at the laugh lines, and that's why that movie's so great. It really exposes how difficult that process was. But I guess with the research we looked at and we did, and what I tested, was we, instead of having a witty observation or a point, we were using personal stories to go for those laugh lines, because your audience really, when you're speaking, they're curious to know a little bit about you, but you want to win over the audience as much as you can at the start and go with likability over everything else, because if they don't like you, they won't laugh at you. But they're also curious to know a little bit about you, and using personal stories in there that just happen to be funny. So what we were doing, and what I was doing all the time, is literally taking my own stories from my own life and telling them in a way that a stand-up comedian would strip it down to its funniest bit. And that way there was no moments where the audience was like, this guy is trying to be funny. And that's huge. It's like when your boss or somebody you know calls you into an office and they're like, hey, I got a joke for you. And you're like, oh, this is not going to be funny. So you've already had the chance to decide that it's not going to be good. So by telling a story, you have no risks. There's no moment in that story where the audience is like, this guy's trying to be funny here. And it was just a very easy and practical way to fill your own talks with small snippets and contents and story from your own life and not risk that moment where it doesn't work.
I feel like I'm putting you on the spot. If I am, just say pass. But can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So, like, I could tell you I put one in a book about me urinating on a fence when I was 7 years old by accident on an electrical fence, of all things. And straight away you'll be like, well, there's no correlation between that and business anyway. And what a comedian will do is try and find a setup statement to allow them to tell that story and relate it to a business topic. So if I say, well, here's the story. I urinated on an electrical fence when I was 7. That's got nothing to do with business whatsoever. My point would be, if you find a setup statement that's relative, makes it relatable, or there's a lesson in there, it gives you an excuse to tell the story. So in this case, it would be, if you don't survey your market before you enter it, you can learn a painful lesson. Here's a painful lesson from my life. So you basically go into the story and out of the story as quickly as possible. And we were seeing that with Ken Robinson's talk. Has over 36 million views on TED at the moment, and is the most viewed TED Talk of all time. And you'll notice within it, there's a number of short stories from his life that are not directly relatable to the topic, which is how schools kill creativity. And within that, he has a short story that's personal to him, that's unique to him, that's very funny, that he's used to telling, and he probably knows where his friends laugh when he busts it out at the Christmas parties, or he busts it out in a social context. And it's a story about him relocating with his family, just moving from England to the UK, and how that affected his one of his kids' girlfriends or boyfriends at the time. So it's a very short story told in a stand-up comedic format, very efficient in its words, and going out of his way to keep the key funny part to the end, which is a huge, huge technique that comedians are very, very efficient at doing to make them look like they have good timing, and then just linking that to his business talk.
One of the biggest things where I think people fall down in all this stuff is they don't understand the macro idea behind even what you and I are talking about right now. And I believe it's that people think they're giving a business presentation. People think that they're doing public speaking. And what they intuitively shy away from, it's not funny, it's not the joke, it's the fact that it actually really is a performance. And they never angle or change that prism to look at it from, what if I did treat this presentation, this moment to say my name, this moment to say what project I'm working on, as a performance. And I know when I say performance, I'm not talking about arms wide open and suddenly I'm going to go into a monologue, like Shakespeare, but it is a moment to perform when you're speaking in front of more than one person.
Oh, 100%. And I think if anyone asks who's the true masters of that performance when it comes to public speaking, you're going to quickly come back to comedians, because they have such a difficult audience. And I mean, to put a spin on that as a business speaker, 9 times out of 10, the audience you're speaking to is completely bored by the other speakers that went on. Like, your bar is very low. Very few people are looking at that as a performance. So if you can give any little bit of humor or entertainment, or go with a story or a tale instead of just showing another graph, all of a sudden you're opening the engagement to that audience, who it's not that difficult to turn into a bunch of people like happy dolphins just going backwards, because in appreciation to any bit of your personality you put in there. But if you script it like a performance, where there's a very clear beginning and you link it back at the end like a comedian would do, you have a strong opening, but you have an even stronger Steve Jobs style finish, and you make sure you go out to a round of applause and have told them some form of a story within that talk, as opposed to a bunch of facts and figures that they can't remember, then you start to treat it like a performance, and they will start to treat you like the star performer.
People always say to me, how do you know when you've done well in a presentation? And I say, it's real simple for me. When I walk over and I return the mic to the AV guy, if he's like, that was really good, or he's laughing, or he was engaged, or he's like, I really learned a lot, that's a home run for me. Because those guys just sit through everything, and they're, like you said, they're just in there drooling half the time, or playing, Candy Crush on their phones. And when you keep their attention, I think you won.
Yeah, and to be honest, even if you just hang around or make yourself available after the talk, you'll notice the amount of people that come up to you is a lot more than a lot of the other speakers, and ultimately you will be more memorable, because if you tell a bit of a story and you put some of your soul on the stage and into it and deliver it in a relatable way with a little bit of entertainment, you are way better than 90% of the people that went on that day ever, and the AV guy will be your best friend.
So you get to this point where you've read the book, Do You Talk Funny? You've listened to this, and there's some thinking in you of I got this. The challenge that most people have, and it's a very commonly held piece of data point, is people would rather die than public speak. There's a fear of public speaking. There's stage fright. There's all these things that we all deal with: nervousness, anxiety, panic. It's a spectrum of emotions that's there. I really think, even for myself, doing stand up would terrorize me in comparison to even the fact that
Yeah,
I've
it's not a
done,
good plan.
yeah, so that I've done, and I've done a ton of public speaking. So what it's nice to say all this stuff, but how do you get people out of the mindset of I'm just terrified? So even like being calm and collected to deliver a joke, that's like, like let me get my black belt first. You know what I mean? Like before I even attempt that.
Yeah, and I think that's the risk item for many people. They think I'm attempting a joke, but I would say don't attempt a joke. Don't ever telegraph that you're trying to be funny. Just tell a story. It's your story, so you're not going to go blank on stage telling it. And even if you leave out some of the elements of it, when you're telling a story, nobody knows except you. For the most part, your risk go down a bit. I mean, there's a couple of things you can do. Reframing it is huge to ease that tension or ease that fear a lot. So, I wish somebody told me at the start, hey, oh, your hands are sweating, your heart is beating, you feel really nervous. Yeah, I'm the same. And I've always been the same. And when there's consequences, you probably always will be the same. But you just reframe that to go, all right, I'm excited. This is what happens when I get excited about something. My heart's going to beat a bit faster. I am going to have the sweaty palms. I am just going to have to take steps to hide this. So I don't want to hold a piece of paper when I go straight on stage. I don't want to take the microphone out if there is one for the first 30 seconds so people don't see my hand shaking if it is. I want to start off with a story that's personal to me that I really care about. That way I'm being conversational and I'm not trying to memorize words. And to be honest, the biggest thing I learned from comedians is an acting technique also, but it's essentially a memorization technique called the memory palace. So the biggest fear for me was standing up there and going blank on stage. And by using a tool called the memory palace, it's essentially taking your bullet point list of topics or your presentation, creating a small story that will be memorable to you and unique around each one of those bullet points, and then placing that story in a location that's very familiar to you. So rather than your talk now being a collection of bullet points, it's actually the house that you live in or the house that you grew up in or the apartment. It's the floor plan, and your talk is just walking from room to room. And at no point are you ever trying to recall a word, which is very hard to do. You're trying to recall a location, which your mind finds easy to do. And in that location, you've stored a story, which is that point of your talk structure. And I think it's a big topic by itself, and it was a very good book called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer. But I think when you use the memory palace for your talk, it's the single biggest thing that puts you at ease as a speaker, because you're like, I'm never going to go blank on stage. And honestly, I've never gone blank on stage using that. Anybody I've taught it to or anybody I know who's used it has never gone blank on stage. And that's a huge one to take off the table, because you get really relaxed all of a sudden. You can even start to watch the speakers before you. I'm sure you've been at a business conference where you're like, why is this guy talking about the same stuff the last guy talked about? And why doesn't he seem to know that we just had a conversation in this room? Is because a lot of the time he's backstage looking over his notes, whereas the memory palace, it just allows you to be a lot more in the moment and a lot more at ease as a speaker. And then it just seems way easier to have a bit of fun with your story and go for some jokes, and relaxes you to acknowledge things that are happening in the moment. But honestly, of all the things I learned probably over the year, that was the single biggest difference, and the single item I think the least amount of people are familiar with or use. And once you start to use it, you become a lot more comfortable with public speaking.
Walking with Einstein is a great book. I mean, it really is a book about sort of this person who attempted to become a grandmaster at memorizing things, right?
And became it, yeah.
And became it, yeah. And it's a great book with a lot of. It's funny the memory. I forgot that it was called the Memory Palace, but I often think about that format too. And it is once you sort of have it in your brain, you know exactly where you're going and how you're going to walk through there. I'm also curious about this idea of. So we've talked about this as you don't necessarily have to be funny. It's understanding the structure and how they do things so that you can deliver a point in a more cogent way.
Yep.
But there is a lot of sort of contentiousness around this idea of start with a joke, don't start with a joke. I tend to fall on the don't start with a joke. Am I insane for saying that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, some people, again, I think it's people always look at it as a joke. And if it's not a joke, if it's an anecdote or a story and it's very relevant to you or your topic, then starting with a laugh or getting a laugh from the audience does put you at ease as a speaker. And it turns the audience on to say, okay, this guy's probably going to be good. I'm going to pay attention. I love the expression, the end of laughter is followed by the height of listening. And if you can get a quick laugh in your talk, you just made the whole room sit up and go, okay, this guy's going to be good.
So
And I
how do
mean,
you know, but how do you know if that opening is going to do well or just completely suck the air out of the room?
well, yeah, well, you test it. So if I walk out into a conference room with a line and I use it and I'm speaking at a business event, I know it's going to work to some extent, or I know there's never going to be a moment where they're like, this guy's trying to be funny. And that's a key way to start off. So I think John Acuff, if you're familiar with his work, is probably the best business speaker I've ever seen. When I was studying this, and he just starts off with short anecdotes that are very relevant to the topic that he's talking about, but also his life, and it allows you to learn a little bit about him. So immediately he draws you in a way where you don't think he's trying to be funny. His story just happens to be funny. And worst case, if it isn't, he still just told you a story. And I think when I was interviewing with him, what was very interesting is he said for every business speaker he's seen, and he's a 5-time or 6-time New York Times bestselling author and very popular speaker, that he's probably seen 100 comedians for every business speaker. So he very consciously studied what they were doing. And I think you can very much do the same with your own material. So what works? Borrow it for someone else, like literally audio record or video record every time you do it, and just see, does it normally make people laugh? And to be honest, you don't even have to be on stage all the time to do that. You can test those little stories with your friends. And if they work on your friends and you actually enjoy telling it and you can link it to your business topic, which you always can, and then you just have to, that's only limited by your own creativity. But I would encourage people just to start looking at it as not trying to open with a joke, just to try and be fun instead of funny, and to look at speakers like John Acuff. Like Louis Van Aan is a great example as well. He has a TED Talk about inventing CAPTCHA. But I mean, the first 30 seconds is just the exact structure that a comedian would use. It's a setup. He leads the audience in the other direction. He makes a joke at himself. And everybody's on board. And anybody I've ever showed that video to, I ask them to rate it and see how likely they think the rest of the talk is funny. And of course, they think it's going to be amazing because he's just grabbed their attention. So to answer your question, I don't think it's a bad thing ever. If you can make the audience laugh straight away, that is a huge strength that grabs their attention. You just want to be conscious of how you're doing it and making sure it's not new what you're saying if it's a high pressure, high stakes environment. So testing a line out is not a good time for your TED Talk, for your first TED Talk. But if you've tested it before today, comedians have always tested every element, so they know what's the strongest performer. They know what's very likely to get a certain reaction, and I think the best business speakers do that too.
The other component of what comedians do that I think is probably extremely profoundly powerful to someone who is doing any form of presenting, it's twofold. It's timing and delivery too. And it's so undervalued or not thought enough about in presentations that it's staggering to me, mostly because people are typically reading presentations, and that's a nightmare to begin with. But I wanted to break the two up just to get your perspective. So first, talk to me a little bit about the power of timing. No joke is funny without good timing.
Yeah, and it's true. So again, that expression I just said, the end of laughter is the height of listening. So if you just make an audience laugh and then you keep talking after that funny word, their automatic reaction is to stop laughing and listen to you because you've just created something that they want more of. They're like, oh, I laughed. That was great. I want to laugh again. He's funny. He's still talking. He's probably going to say something funny again. So what a lot of business speakers do is when they get that laugh, they're not conscious of where that laugh is likely to come from, or they don't note it or record it or listen back to see where the laughs were. And then once you identify the key funny part that got a laugh, the key funny part to your story, or even the key funny word, what a comedian will do to look like he has amazing timing, or a comedy writer will do, is move that funny word to the last possible word. So if that funny word or the twist in the story, so like we said, comedy is 1, 2, 4. If the word that gives the 4 in that sequence away can be moved to the very end, then everybody will be allowed time to laugh because you've inserted a natural pause where you know they're likely going to laugh. And as a result, your timing or delivery looks amazing. So if I'm telling you a story about a sheep being in a car, probably not that normal downtown Montreal, a bit more likely in Ireland, then obviously the strange element is the sheep being in the car. If I'm telling that story to an audience, they're probably going to laugh once they discover the word sheep. So instead of saying there was a sheep in that car, a comedy writer or a comedian will go out of their way to rewrite it, even though it feels a little bit strange to say at first, to say, and in that car there was a sheep. And the key word to that whole story now is at the end. And just by pausing at the natural end of the sentence, my timing looks amazing just by restructuring that sentence. And it's a very key thing that only comes from really consciously writing out what you're going to say as a short form story and looking at it and be like, all right, like where are they going to laugh? Where's it going to come from? And how do I facilitate that laugh? And in doing so, your timing looks awesome.
And then delivery, which is delivery is I mean, you can unpack it for days. We could probably do a whole show on delivery because it's everything from voice, timbre, body language. I mean, there's so many components of it that go beyond just, I think when I say delivery, people think it's what words come out of your mouth, but it's not.
It's not, and it's how you deliver them. But I'll tell you, the nice thing with comedy itself and comedy writing and funny stories in any way is the content trumps the delivery. So I've seen guys, and I know guys who've made a living off comedy. They've actually been in the Montreal Just for Laughs festival near you as well, where they literally just look at their feet for the whole delivery. They don't make eye contact with anyone. They don't move. They don't do anything. And I've seen a bunch of the guys who write for Saturday Night Live do this in clubs as well. They just come and they either read the content straight off their hand or they just memorize it and say it without their facial expression changing in any way, shape or form, deadpan the delivery, and then just note how good it is and off they go. So the nice thing is there's a million things you can do around delivery that do have a big impact. But if your writing is good enough and the content is good enough, it will nearly literally speak for itself in the end. But I mean, in the case of comedians, little things like raising your voice on the key joke line and, you know, stepping forward a little bit towards the audience, obviously moving your hands a little bit. There's all key little things you can do to make that look better and leaving the audience time to laugh and appreciate what you're doing. But honestly, if the content is crafted well enough, there's a lot of delivery items that you can mess up and still look like a really good speaker.
And people who diminish that, just think about this. You've watched a stand-up comedian, you thought the joke was one joke was hilarious, and you try and tell it to a friend and how bad that always goes. That is timing and delivery in action, where the content of it can be great, but you've mangled it so much that actually it hurts the content too, which does happen.
Yeah, 100%. But think about this. You go to see someone who's not like Jerry Seinfeld, who's not a very short form joke, and it's more Bill Burr or Louis C.K., and they told you a story, then I can retell that story a lot easier because I can recall it. So, I mean, there's a lot of times when we've been to a comedy club, listened to a comedian absolutely kill it for an hour and left and went, you know what? I can't actually remember what I was really laughing at. I know it was funny. I know there was something about an airplane, but I can't remember it. It's because your mind literally learns and remembers in stories. So a funny thing is it's very hard to share that joke and do it justice, even if you do happen to consciously make an effort to remember it. Whereas if a guy gets up there and tells a 4 or 5 minute bit that's all built around a story, you'll find that you're actually able to do a bit of justice to the retelling of that story. It literally sticks in your head there somewhere. And then when you watch business speakers like John Acuff doing that, using comedians' techniques but telling stories, I remember all his bits and I can tell you them, and my timing and delivery is not as important as getting across the story, and you'll probably laugh a little bit. All right, you're not going to be falling over sideways in the same way that you would when he delivered it himself, but you're all of a sudden just playing into memorability. And I think whether you're funny or not, or fun or not, the ultimate objective to be in public speaking is to be memorable. Because if you weren't, or engaging, or have those people share your message for you, then were you even there?
So the other stuff, the content you talk about, which I think is also so awesome, is rehearsed spontaneity. It's an area that I think the more you speak, the more you feel those moments. And I'll often get, where I get my laughs, I think I think the laughs are happening because people think it's something I said off the cuff or in passing or something I may have flubbed over, knowing full well in my world, I knew where I was putting that joke. I knew how to deliver it in that way, and I do it, let's call it every time, because it gets that laugh, or it helps me with the transition to go somewhere else. And I never really put my sort of label on it, but when I was reading Do You Talk Funny, and I saw this rehearsed spontaneity, I thought, yeah, I get a lot of credit for that. I think like I get
Yeah.
like I almost like I rely on it too much. Like I think Jerry Seinfeld would probably pull me aside and go, it's a bit much on that, like take it easy on that.
No, no way. I mean, that. If you do it, you pull it off, and you're getting laughs. That is perfect. I mean, we're never trying to be Jerry Seinfeld. Most comedians try and fail. He's a truly unique guy, and if you were trying to copy him for business, you would be going
You're
bad.
done.
So if you're getting laughs with what you're doing, rehearse spontaneity is a key way of doing it. And to be honest, it just comes from knowing where your laughs are, knowing the questions the audience are likely to ask, or having an answer for most items are coming your way, and find that person in the audience that's going to allow you to tell that story.
So
So
give a great example. I want to know from you, like, what's a great example for you of rehearsed spontaneity?
Well, yeah, I was in New York actually doing some book promotion stuff for the last 2 days, and I dropped in. Somebody asked me to drop into a comedy club, so I was like, all right, I'll do it. I haven't been doing this in ages, but just for fun, why not? And I went in, and there was a girl from China in the front row, and that came up during the show that she was from China. I went to the audience looking for other people. I was like, all right, you guys don't look like a bunch of people Columbus would have found when he got here. Who else is foreign? And I literally just start mining for stories that I already have answers for. So as soon as I find someone from China, I now told a 7-minute story that was very, very funny and very well punched up and put together about China. And to everybody that's in that room, it looked like I just spontaneously happened to be sharing a slice of my life with those guys. Whereas I've told that story before, I know where they're going to laugh, and I was just basically walking people into the opportunity for me to tell that story. So I remember I gave a business talk last week, and there was someone in the crowd from Taiwan, and it came up in the questioning, and I was like, well, Taiwan, would you say you're a very creative culture? You're very innovative? And she's like, oh, yes. And I was like, what's the name of your leading beer in Taiwan? And she said, Taiwan beer. And of course, that's not exactly the most creative example anyone's ever heard of. Everybody laughs, but I've very much walked her into that laugh. If there's someone in the room, and over time, I will have an answer for anyone from any nationality in that room. And it looks like I'm just creating content on the spot in that moment. But to be honest, I've done it before, and it was a different person from Taiwan or Brazil or wherever the country from was the time before. And I'm just walking them into spontaneous looking pieces that I want to share. And I think the ultimate example of this is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So he's very much well documented that the day he gave that famous speech, he did not plan to say anything about having a dream. It was not in his speech notes. Somebody just kept shouting it at him backstage while he was saying it. Tell them about the dream, Martin. And he did, Martin, and he did, and he built it in. But to be honest, it's estimated he did 350 talks alone that year, and he had mentioned the I Have a Dream component many times. So it was something that got a good, favorable reaction. He knew it, he'd tested it, he'd used it. So when the big day came and the opportunity came to do something a bit impromptu, he was pulling tested material. And in fact, something that looked like was very spontaneous was very much rehearsed spontaneity. He knew it was going to work. And I think a lot of great talks are like that.
But there's also a lot of riffing on that idea. There's also a lot of things that when you're speaking and then you're exposing yourself to other components as you're in between presentations, like stuff really brews inside. And I think we also start seeing things that people who really know that they're going to be put in the presentation realm, it's like you're absorbing things and somehow they can make their way in as well.
No, 100%. And I think whatever is going on in that room, or whatever is that shared experience with you and the audience, that's the easiest way to ever get laughs. Just acknowledging people in the room, acknowledging things that happened in the room, talking about the speaker that went before you. The audience gives you a lot of credit for visibly doing something in the moment that had to be by nature of the way you brought it up in the moment. It's a shared experience between you and them, and it stops it being a theater performance, and it makes it much much a very shared performance between you and them that they don't know. This surely must be original. He couldn't be talking about this because it just happened right now. And it's just playing on the energy of that and people's natural appreciation for impromptu speaking. Like, I'm sure you've given a talk before where you're like, I didn't plan including that, and that got the biggest laugh.
Always.
It was, yeah.
And you're like, I need to remember that for the next one.
100%. And that's what a great comedian or speaker does. When they hit on that moment, it feels good, you remember it, but they very consciously, quickly get off stage and write it down or listen back to the audio. And most of the time, they won't take a chance of leaving the audio recording to the venue that they're in, or they won't wait to get the video 2 months later, which sometimes happen with business conferences. They'll just have their smartphone in their back pocket on record. They'll listen back to the audio when they come off, and they'll go, all right, there's a spontaneous laugh. I'm going to recreate that next time.
Last area I want to unpack with you a little bit is this idea of controlling the audience, which is a big component of your book. It's a big component of what makes great stand-up comedians and magicians very, very effective in a room. I also think it's probably the most intimidating thing that a business professional wants to hear. And the reason I say that is because the one thing business professionals believe they can't control is actually the audience. They can control the stage, they can control the content, they can control their slides, they can control if they're going to read them or tell stories, but they can't control the audience. And for a stand-up comedian, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not a stand-up comedian, that a heckler to some comedians is considered the biggest concern, but to some, they look at the heckler as like, oh, this is just going to be the greatest thing ever. And there's stories of comedians who will go off on a heckler for 20 plus minutes and then decide the entire rest of the set's now going to be working the room into hell with their set. Again, that to me feels like a heightened level of skill, that sort of beyond black belt component of it. And not that you toss it away in the book, it's a big component of the book, but talk a little bit about what that person can do, not to necessarily control the audience, although you do use the phrase control the audience.
Yeah. No, and I do, and I love that. Like, if somebody heckles me, that's my eyes open up and I get excited because I'm like, oh, this is going to be fun. Because to be honest, you will have a lot more short form witticisms to come back with normally. Now, to be honest, that level of control increases with the amount of time you publicly speak. So you've heard a question like that before. You begin to get comfortable with dealing the situation. You know how to shut them off, but you know you have to wait to do it until the audience really approves and you shutting them off, or they're going to turn on you. So I gave a talk for the book launch actually at the NASDAQ Center here in San Francisco last week. And so I said, any questions? And this lady just started telling a story. She's like, oh, I'll tell you my story. And I was like, well, we only have like a minute for questions. What's your question? She says, no, let me tell the story. And I was like, no, give me back the microphone. And everyone in the room's like, who wants to hear her tell a story? I asked them, and someone was like, let her do it. And just being sarcastic. And I was like, no, not happening. She's like, should I tell the story? And I was like, no, time for you to give me the microphone. Let's go. And you just very visibly take it back and don't allow that situation to happen, because the audience is telling you, like, okay, it's okay to stop her talking now. We've had enough of her as well. Let's move on. And a lot of the time you can achieve that just by really saying back, acknowledging whatever question they had that was disruptive, and just being very forthright in the way you control the audience. Like, talk to them, make it very interactive. Do you want us to stop here? Okay, well, on we go. And if you don't make that decision, the audience will nearly turn on you for not managing the event that they see you as the orchestrator of. I mean, you're the conductor, you have the microphone, and with that microphone, you have the power to deal with someone in a way that's either funny. I mean, you can treat them as an unwelcome interruption and make a lot of fun of it if you're very skilled at doing it. But otherwise, you just have to really take control of them as a group. But sometimes that can be just done by something as simple as asking them for a round of applause at a certain time period. It can be conditioning them to get used to a certain set of behaviors. It can be not allowing your talk to finish on a questions and answer session, which is always a recipe for disaster, because you don't control the ending anymore. And there's just little ways you can manipulate that interaction that very much shows people you're in control. So I'm sure you've been at a business talk where the presenter at the end was like, literally, any questions for Mitch? And you're just standing on stage and you don't know if someone's going to have a question or not. And maybe they do, maybe they don't, but you feel really super awkward in that period where nothing's really happening. but now you don't have a way of controlling the ending. If you allow your talk to finish on that Q&A, people don't know when it's over. You end up walking off stage, even if you've just given an amazing talk, to kind of sporadic applause, because they're never sure if it's totally finished or not. So in that case, for example, you literally just say, all right, I'm going to take some questions before I make my conclusion. And then you save a summary slide that has 3 main points of your conclusion. And that way you control the ending and you control the audience. And there's just lots of little tips like doing that will have a big impact on your public speaking overall.
That was great talking to you, David. I appreciate your time so much. Your book is called Do You Talk Funny? You've got a really interesting conference going on called Funny Bizz, which is BIZZ. Let people know where they can best connect to your work.
Yeah, sure. So you can get a lot of the tips and the techniques from the book totally for free at the number 7comedyhabits.com, or we're also at funnybiz with 2z's.co. And there's a blog there that has a lot about humor and business, and we also do run a conference around it. And I am at funnybizsf on Twitter. Worst handle ever intentionally, because I don't go on there a lot, but I am contactable that way.
Awesome. Thanks again so much for your time.
Thank you.